Can you reverse that one to go over again if you have to?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll probably have you to stop it a few times.
Okay, well, we're recording right now.
You are.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, shall I? I'll start in when you want me to. Uh,
Now's the time.
well, I thank you folks for having me here tonight. I appreciate the opportunity. And one of the things that I'd like to have you as members is refrain from throwing the rotten eggs and the tomatoes, because I've only brought one suit of clothes. So if we'll do that, we'll get on with the story of the Oliver family first. My grandfather was born in 1855 in the Azore Islands, in the island of Peak. They are about located somewhere between 750 and 1,000 miles northwest of the northwest corner of Africa. He left home as a cabin boy on a two-masted whaling schooner when he was about 12 or 13 years old. He sailed many of our seas and oceans. One of his first of his trips down through off the coast of Africa, they came upon a slave ship, and the slave ship thought they were going to be raided, and all the slaves were chained together, and they ran them overboard and drowned them. Then another incident of his was off of the coast of Newfoundland. He'd been a long time on the water, and he was promoted to harpooner's mate on the raft, rowboat, that the harpooner stood in the bow of it, and with 2 or 3 sets of oars, plus a man in the stern with a big tub of coil of line, and in the center was a stanchion where, after they harpooned the whale, it took off, and they kept pouring water on this stanchion to keep the line from getting too hot. When the whale would die, they would tie a buoy on it, and the mothership would come and pick up the whale. Grandpa married my grandmother in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which was a big Portuguese fishing city, and it still is today. Many Portuguese come from the old country, were located there. After a while, he married my grandmother, and 2 children were born there, Will and Carrie. Later years, he started off, and they sailed off of the coast of South America, around Cape Horn, up along the coast of South America, Monterey, San Diego, and further north. When they got off the coast of Ventura, I imagine they were probably looking through their spy glasses and spotted a lot of the little Indian maids up on the mountain over there, and they wanted to come ashore. The captain says, "Hell no, we're not stopping now until you get to Monterey." My grandfather and the other man, another fellow rather, they jumped overboard and swam ashore, and Grandpa told me that he figures that they must have still swam somewhere between 2 and 3 miles, landing right about where the Ventura Marina is today. They walked up. Well, before that, all he had to his name was 25 cents in his pocket and a little English stiletto. That stiletto is still in the family today, or it's been donated to the Ventura Museum. He stayed there for some time, and he got in contact with my grandmother, and she came across the United States either by train to San Francisco, and from San Francisco to Los Angeles by stagecoach, or there was a southern route that came into Los Angeles, and he met my grandmother there. Pardon me. My grandfather stayed there for some time, and that's where my father was born. Later on, he came to the vicinity of Oxnard, and settled about 18 miles northeast of Oxnard, and 9 miles west of Moorpark. There was no town here at that time. He started a homesteaded property on, we called it Long Canyon Road at that time, but today you call it Waters Road. There, 8 more children were born. Four, four, uh, four girls. I mean, yeah, four girls, and 6 boys. It makes a family of altogether, I think, 11. Grandpa farmed the hills back there off of that Long Canyon Road, and the boys were old enough and the girls were old enough to work on the farm. Grandpa had cattle, corn, black-eyed peas or beans, whatever you want to call them, and grain. He also had some apricots in there, but not many. Shut it off for a second. Got to catch my breath. Frank and Fels were in the World War I. Frank served time in Germany. Fels never got out from Camp Kearney in San Diego. Then there was George and Johnny. That's all the boys. The other girls born was Carrie came across with the grandma. Then there was Mary, Louise, Julia, and Annie. The girls stayed home. Louise and Julia stayed home until quite late, quite old, before they married. And Fels and Frank, they married and settled in Southern California. My dad, when he left home, started to work on the railroad from somewhere between Oxnard and Santa Susana. This was way before 1900. He started to farm about 1905 when he married my mother, right around the time he married my mother. That was up off of the corner of Belcom Road and Stockton Road on the west side. I came along in July of 1907. My brother Albert came along 18 months later, and he passed away some 30 years ago. Roy was 10 years younger than I. He lives in Clear Lake, out of Sacramento. My dad farmed beans up there, but before he had beans, or lima beans, it was dryland sugar beets. That was before I never saw a crop because that was about the time I was born. There was a station at Lagolle where Balcom Canyon stops on the highway. There was a station there called Lagolle that was a beet dump. And these beet dumps were a ramp that went up quite high, higher than your gondola railroad cars. You parked your wagon there, and the wagon was turned on its side, and all the beets would go into the wagon, and then you go down the other side. This is way before any kind of tractors. And then they were taken to the factory in Oxnard to be processed. And the factory in Oxnard was built somewhere right around 1900. There's also the same thing at where Belcom Canyon, and I don't mean Belcom Canyon. The first road, this east side of the Belcom Canyon Road, called Ternez, and there was the same setup there. There was no other sugar beets I know of that was raised on the east side from that particular road. All of them were raised on the west side and down mostly south of the railroad track in Camarillo, where American Crystal Sugar had hundreds and hundreds of acres down there, and they leased it to the farmers, something like 60 acres, with 20 acres in sugar beets, 20 acres in lima beans, and 20 acres in alfalfa. Alfalfa put the nitrogen back in the ground because we had no fertilizers for sugar beets at that time. Everything that I can remember of, there was no orchards. There were a few orchards of walnuts west of this area. Not many. Most of it was all open ground of lima beans. West, from where the railroad crosses west of Moore Park, there was walnuts and apricots, clear in through Moat Park up to about the junction of where Strathern Cross, we call it Strathern's Crossing today. There was up in the area where we're sitting today, in the Fairview area, we called it Upworth at that time, was all apricots. There was no walnuts in here that I know of. Some of the ranchers were in here was Mose Waters, the Kerr brothers, Dellaway, and I don't know who, can't think of any of the others, but I know there was more. We had a lot of grain raised up in this area, and as well as cattle. You go over further east from this area with what we call Happy Camp, and there was some apricots in there. Then down around Moat Park was only about 2 small apricot orchards there. Dave Flory had one, and the Birkinshaws and the Gieslers and my father and everybody else in there was all walnuts. You go further west, it was A.H. Hitch and Clarence Everett and Frank Everett. They were the 3 of the largest apricot growers. All the Estes brothers were in. The Estes Ranch was in that vicinity too, on the north side of the road. They, Mr. Hitch and Mr. Everett would go to Los Angeles and bring in their crew during the apricot season, which was in the neighborhood of from the 4th of July. And it was a regular tent city there. And I imagine they had somewhere around 200 or 300 people between the 2 or 3 of them working, picking apricots and pitting apricots and drying them and so forth. Apricots in those times, as most of you probably don't know, they were hand-picked off of the ground or off of the tree, put in boxes about 2 cubic feet, and they paid the people, if they did that, something like 5 cents a box. The women pitted the apricots, but they had to be done a certain way. The apricot was held, and the knife would have to go, so it was supposed to go clear around the apricot, and the pit taken out. They were laid on trays about 4 foot by 6 foot long, with the cup up. Those were stacked about 12 or 15 high, water sprayed on them, put into a smudge house, and covered, and sulfur was poured down on, and set on fire, and they stayed in there usually 18 to 24 hours. Taken out of that, they were taken and laid in the field side by side. You'd see acres of them till the sun dried them, and when after the sun dried them at a certain time, a certain amount, they were all, these trays were all scraped and put in big bins, and then the buyers would come and buy them. Walnuts were picked by hand and dried in trays also, and then we took them to the warehouse in Walnut Warehouse here in Moore Park, and then they were processed and shipped away. The Oliver family, Grandpa and Grandma, celebrated their golden anniversary in 1927. In 1929, his 2 sisters were married, and they celebrated their golden anniversary, and they, all 6 of them, were still alive at the same time. I wrote to Ripley, of Ripley's Believe It or Not, in that time, and I asked him if he had anything like that in his records. He says, wrote back and he says, yes. He says, I have 4 brothers who married 4 sisters in the 1600s, and all of them were still alive. So that's quite a, we thought we had quite a feat ourselves in the family. That just about does the most of I can think of the Oliver family. Grandpa passed away in the early 40s, and Grandma passed away in the middle 40s. I moved to, I was as a little chap growing up on this ranch. I can remember several instances there. I rode to grammar school, which was located on what is now Waters Road, single on a horse. And I would say that was about 2 miles, maybe 3 miles. And then when my brother got old enough to go into the first grade, and I was in the second. We rode double, and later on my father bought a cart, and we rode on that. And then my cousins, who lived about a mile below us on Welcome Canyon Road, they had a cart, and there was about five of that family. And when they moved away about 1915, and we moved away in 1917, they had to close the school, because in those days you could keep a grammar school going with 6 children, and they only left 4 when we moved away. I believe that, I can remember this. One time my mother had to go to the grocery store, as before my dad bought an automobile in 1913. We hooked the old babes to the buggy and went to Oxnard, my brother and I, in the buggy. That was quite a chore, about 16, 18 miles for a round trip. And when he bought the car in 1913, there was buggies didn't travel as much in those days. We've had, about 1913 he bought the Studebaker. 1915 he bought another Studebaker, and then in 1917 he bought a Chalmers, which is a forerunner of the Chrysler automobile. Now, getting back to my mother's side of the family, my grandfather Joe Terry, he came to the United States shortly after my grandfather, and he settled in the Arroyo Grande area. That's where my mother and 2 of her brothers were born. My grandmother passed away, and my grandfather remarried, and then there was one more child born. I'll tell you the instance when my mother used to tell me when they lived in Arroyo Grande, they used to hook the wagon and the team and put a single plow on it and go to Pismo, which isn't too far away, and go along the ocean and plow up the old Pismo clams, throw them in the wagon, and bring them home and break them open with a hammer and feed them to the chickens. That was quite a thing in those days, I would think. Today, try and get a Pismo clam. You have to go out there and water up to here to get them. And my grandfather settled in the Somas area, about where Center School comes into the highway. And there is where my mother and 2 brothers and sister lived. When my mother married my father, and they moved up to this ranch off of Welcome Canyon Road. Her youngest sister and the second wife left, and they spent most of her time in Los Angeles. The 2 brothers stayed on the ranch with my grandfather, about where the Center Schoolhouse. They were on the north side of the road from the Center Schoolhouse, and he farmed there. The older brother Joe, he left there and went down into the what is now Watts today, farming. And George and my grandfather went up on. My grandfather bought this ranch up on Price Road, and George stayed there with my grandfather. And then they also had property on the west side of Oxnard. George passed away in during World War I of the flu that was the epidemic at that time, and Grandpa stayed there until he passed away in 1925. Offhand, I can tell many, many stories back there, but they're too numerous for me to remember, I guess you'll call it. Let's shut up for a second or two, whatever, if you don't mind. As I said before, we moved into the Mopark area around 1917 and settled. My father bought this walnut ranch on the south side of town where the intersection is, where the signal is. Today when I came up, we stopped there at the Circle K, and that's part of the ranch that my dad bought. He bought 52 acres of walnuts there from a people by the name of Howard. In those days, he paid $50,000 for these 52 acres. Making the turn, describing, I went to school, grammar school then. I was in the 6th grade. We come into Mopark, and I'll describe a little bit of the town of Mopark. After you cross the railroad track, on the northwest corner was Tanner's Garage. Tanner came into Mopark before we moved there, and he lived and worked north of town, north there for a man by the name of R.J. Batty, I think it was. But from Tanner's Garage along the street going east, the first building was the Fred McLaughlin grocery store. It was a big wooden building. The next building was Jim Barrett's pool room. That was Crutch Barrett's father, and he had a little restaurant beside of it. Then further east was Louis Carnes' barber shop. Then east again, on the corner was the was the bank, and west of the bank was George Rydell's sweet shop and the Jakes Brothers grocery store. George Rydell sold that sweet shop in later years, I think, to Wayne Everett's wife. I'm not positive. Across the street was, I can't remember a building on the corner, but the next building was the old telephone office. Mabel Braggerty and her two daughters and two sons lived there. The telephone office was was built into the house, about 10 foot wide and 15 foot long. And in those days, the telephones, you had to ring the bell by hand and wake them up in the daytime because it was only open between 8 and 5, and they sat there and probably went to sleep, and you had to ring them. And that was, like I say, it was only open from 8 to 5. In later years, it was open 24 hours a day, and they had their bed right there beside the exchange. Well, we had a little trouble with our tape, so we'll try and recap some of the things that we said and did. The water system in Mopark was a kind of a hit and miss proposition, and the water supply was from a couple of tunnels on the northeast of town, about a mile above the town, half a mile. When we were kids, we used to go up and play in those tunnels. A fellow by the name of Robinson had one horse and a wagon and his tools, and he's the one that took care of the water system. The town of Mopark, someplace in after that, when we got a better water system, bought 500 foot of fire hose rather, and that was what we had for our fire. Before that, Mopark had a two-wheeled cart with a tank on it that held about 20 or 30 gallons of water plus baking soda and sulfuric acid, which would mix and would cause a fomite, and that was what we used for the fires. Then later on, they got a pretty good water system in there, and Frank Everett donated a Model T Ford and took the body off of it and made a box on it and put this hose on. Later on, Mr. Birkinshaw's home, when he built the big new home down on the boulevard, he had a barn in the backyard back, which was divided into 3 compartments. One half of it was the living quarters, 1/3 of it rather, and 1/3 was the hay mow, and the other third was for the stock. It caught on fire, and we came down there with the fire hose and laid the line all out and tried to put the fire out, and there was we couldn't do it. So I turned to Mr. Birkinshaw and I says, Mr. Birkinshaw, why don't we go at your place and put water on the side of your house, shut all the windows, be sure and shut all the windows, and we'll water that down so it won't catch on fire, and let the thing burn down because we can't put it out, and you won't have such a big mess to clean up. Mr. Birkinshaw said, fine and dandy, let's do that. So that's what we did. In later years, the county furnished a fire engine, about a 300-gallon fire engine, and I.G. Tanner was made the chief and kept it there in his garage. We high school kids work with him whenever I'd go on a fire. Then later years, the county put a fire station right where the grammar school was, on part of the grammar school line, and had 2 fellows there running the station. One of the fellows' name was Ross Slade, an old-timer around the area here. I don't know whether I mentioned that Mark Kennedy was the constable here, and Colson was the justice of peace.
Then we had a jail. I don't know. We mentioned that before. We had a jail that was off of on the east side of Second Street, and all we had one fellow that I knew that was ever in jail. We called him Shorty. He was a town drunk. He shot somebody, but it didn't kill him, and they put him in there for a couple of days. Everybody had to come out of Ventura from the fire department. I mean, from the police department. I could probably go on for hours and hours if somebody would quiz me on some of the things that happened here in Mopar. I think I mentioned before that the older generation, 10 years older than 15 years older than I, you'd probably call them a gang today. They would go to Simi and Santa Susana and turn over all the outhouses. One time they put a buggy on top of the barn in Tanner's garage, and Mrs. Tanner didn't even know it, and they lived less than 100 feet away. We kids got a bunch of farm equipment and pushed it from the railroad depot where it was parked in front of the Jim Barrett's pool room. Other things that happened here, we had, I forgot this, in the early 30s, Mopark had an apricot festival. It was quite a thing. It was something very much of, was all apricots, how they canned them, how they picked them and all, and a great big tent on the railroad property between the highway and the railroad track. They did that. That was about 1930. We even had a road race, automobile road race, started at Tanner's garage and went east about 3-4 blocks. I had a 1929 Chevrolet, hopped up a little bit, and I was in the race. Well, I raced a Model T Ford. I've forgotten who was opposite me, and I tried to race. They outran me. I couldn't keep up with that Model T Ford. And for enjoyment in those days, we had, it was starting of the automobile coming in. We always had a May Day picnic up at the Oak Park. It was three-legged races and sack races and fat man's race and all those type of races. That was one of our annual outings. Also, people would go on picnics around, go into Ventura and go to Foster Park and picnic there and make the rounds through Ojai and come back through Fillmore and Santa Paula into Mopar. Now, way back in my first trip to the Santa Barbara Islands, well, even before that, when I was a little kid, we used to go down to Point Magoo and dig mud clams, which was quite an outing. Then, after World War I, the Japanese come in here and had a fish camp there with a couple of big boats, fishing boats, and a couple of smaller ones, and they had 2 barges there. And one winter, these 2 fishing boats got caught in a storm, and one of them came into there and rolled over, and no one was drowned. The other one got back safe, the island safe. I talked about the railroad previously, and before they built the railroad through Mopar, they wanted to put it along the coast, but the Range and the Broome estate owned practically all that land and wouldn't sell the right-of-way. So the Range estate built their own little railroad down in their estate. And I know after they built the railroad, the highway around Magoo to Santa Monica, which was in 1928, when I drive down that area, you could still see the old right-of-way. Now the railroad come through Mopar and stopped up around Simi, it come through Oxnard, up around Simi, and turned around and went back. The main rail line came in through Castaic, through Newhall, Castaic, Piru, and down the east side of Ventura with a Y, and it was was able to turn around there and come through Oxnard, clear up to the Santa Susana Pass, and stop there. The tunnel, I think, was built, completed about 1910, and then they were able to come all the way through from Chatsworth on go up the coast. Well, that take care of practically all the railroads, as far as I know. Magoo come in, the Navy camp came in there during World War II. Oh, I forgot to mention one time during World War I, one of the trains stopped at Mill Park to pick up troops, and we were all right there wishing, telling them all goodbye. There was 2 trains after they got the tunnel built that had come through both directions, passenger trains, 2 locals that would stop at every stop along the road, and the Lark, which was a fast train and only stopped at a few places. The mail was brought in, both trains brought mail. The ones that stopped, they unloaded there at the depot, and the other one would pick up the mail on the fly. It was hanging on a pedestal with a railroad sack, the mail sack hung between 2 hooks, and there was a hook on the railroad car, and they'd open it up and pick the sack up and come into the car. I remember one time it threw off a bunch of money. They went to the bank, and they sack broke open, and money was scattered all up and down the highway, the railroad track, and there was every town turned out to pick it up, and they only lost a few dollars.
Do you happen to remember going to the old theater?
Oh yeah. After Jim Barrett passed away, I don't know, he had this little restaurant on the side of his pool room, and he was starting his stove there, and it exploded and caught him on fire. And he ran up the street on fire, or the fire was out, I guess, to the doctor. And I don't think it was Dr. Yoakum we had there at that time. It was the other doctor. And they patched him up a little bit, and they took him to the hospital in Oxnard, to St. John's, and that's where he passed away. Then another fellow took over that pool room, and then he disappeared. And when Fred McLaughlin had the grocery store, I can remember when peace was declared in World War I, they made a dummy and hung it up in the tree of the Kaiser William. And I can't remember whether they shot it full of holes and then set it on fire. That was one of the things after World War I. Then Fred McLaughlin, a fellow by the name of, bought him out, and built a store right on the corner, across the street from the bank. Bob Adair was his name, and they tore down all those buildings there, the pool room, and Roy Hallfelt built that whole corner up. He built the theater, and he built his pool room, and then right on the corner he had a dry goods store. A fellow by the name of Justice run that, and the theater was in there. And if I remember right, the first machines that we had there, we didn't have weren't electric. You had to turn it by hand to run the film, and then when the reel run out, they had to turn the lights on and put another reel in. Then later on, the fellow got 2 machines. One, he ran the reel and changed the reel on the other machine, and that's the way it was trying back and forth. I remember that very distinctly. And well, can you think of anything else that you might ask? I know that that's...
Would you care to say anything about the time you spent in high school?
What I spent in high school? Well, I tell you, the high school, as I said before, the high school, before they built the high school up on the hill, was down at the ladies' clubhouse in the old dance hall. They had one or 2 years there, and then but in the high school there was 4 teachers plus the principal, and And then my last 8th grade in grammar school, they'd moved it from the 3-room school up there to the high school, and that's where I graduated from grammar school. In the high school, we had about 50 boys and girls at that time, I think, in the school. And I spent my 4 years, well, I spent really 5 years because I didn't graduate in my 4th year. But we never had hot water. We never had hot water till I think about the last year of my high school days. And when the other teams would come in here and have to take water in that cold showers, boy, they raised particular Cain. Now we played football on where you go up Peach Hill. John Agour farmed that area, and he cut all the hay off of us, and we played on that hay stubble because the school ground at the high school was too lopsided. The Oxnard came up there one year, and they found out that we was playing on all that dirt, so they ran their crew, all their players over the beef fields that were worked down there around Oxnard to kind of break them into that. And the visiting team would use our boys' showers, and we would use the girls' showers. That was did that. We had some pretty good track teams. We had fair basketball teams and football team. I think we were a little better in the football teams. We played Oxnard one year and we lost to them 12-13, and we beat Ventura. I think it was 14-0. One of the hardest games we played was with Ojai, and the score was 0-0. And before we had football, we played soccer, and we used to go up to Thatcher, which was the rich people's rich parents' children that went up there, and we played them, and they came to Mopar. I have a couple of annuals that I'm going to let you people look at today, and look through them and see what you think of what it was way back in 1924, 27 in that neighborhood. I think I mentioned the churches, I believe, in the previous reel, and my brother and I, when we was going to catechism in Somas, we'd take the horse and buggy and go down there. That's before my dad had an automobile. And then he got an automobile, and I took my first communion in the church in Camarillo. And about that time is when we moved shortly after that is when we moved to Mopar. I think that's gives a pretty good description of the area.
Oh, that's marvelous. We've been fortunate enough to have an interview with Clarence Oliver, an old-time resident of the Somas Moore Park area. Thank you, Clarence.
You're welcome, and it's been a pleasure to be here.